to domestic policy. We're going to focus now on the home front, and we're going to talk about the presidencies of Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower. We want to explain the Truman administration's efforts on the domestic front. What was his domestic agenda and what was his fair deal? Describe President Eisenhower's domestic agenda. Those are the two primary objectives today. But first, let's talk about the GI Bill. The GI Bill was established to help servicemen coming back from the war get back on their feet. The GI Bill was really set up to do a lot of things. It was set up to help GIs buy a home, go to college, start their own business. It was a way, because GI, of course, stood for government issued, if you recall, a government issued soldier to come home and start his life all over again back in the United States. For those who had gone overseas and risked their lives to save the world, we're going to give these boys a hand up. And that was the GI Bill. It was a hand up for the troops, who definitely had done a lot for us. Now, President Truman immediately is facing inflation in the post-war economy and strikes. He is under pressure to keep the economy going, and he has to deal with rising prices due to shortages in certain parts of the economy, as the economy needs to now readjust from being an economy set up to build for a military, but now refocuses attention on a consumer economy. That's a change where an economy has to make. Because of that, there are shortages in some areas. There are demand in areas that can't make the shortage, and because of that, prices rise. When prices rise, people hate it because their money buys them less, so that leads to inflation. Inflation is always the enemy of people who work and people who save, but it's an enemy to all of us because rising prices means we have to work harder to get more. Strikes happened during this time. Particularly, there were some strikes in some of the coal mines that were needed to keep the energy going. President Truman, at one point, had to break the strike. The strikers were unworking. The coal wasn't getting out, and people could freeze. So Truman threatened at one point to put the strikers in the Army. I'll draft you guys on strike in the Army if you don't come to terms with the bosses. Now, he also went to the bosses and said, you need to give in some to the boys. But Truman stepped in. And because of this, he was criticized. Criticized by labor and criticized by both sides of the battle. People felt he was mingling in the economy a little too much. They weren't sure what to make of Harry Truman. They felt he had inherited the presidency from FDR, and they really weren't sure if he was up for the job. But he was the president. And so in 1946, Truman faces his first major test. In that election, the Republicans ran a campaign. It's now after the war. So they said it's time for a change. It's time for a change because the Democrats had been in power going all the way back to 1930. And here it is in 1946. We've had the White House and Congress dominated by New Deal era Democrats. And a group of young post-war Republicans are coming up and saying, it's time for a change, time to break the mold, time for some new ideas, and of the stale old. Congress is swept by the Republicans. Now Truman has to work with these Republicans to try and get his through. But the Republicans come up with the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act is going to do a few things. For one, it's going to ban the closed shop. The closed shop is a workplace in which only union workers can allow. It's going to create right-to-work laws. It's going to say if your place of employment has a union, and someone new wants to come along and work for you, they don't have to join the union. They have, the worker, a right to work. This is a change in policy. The unions don't like this, but they're not in control now because they fell out with Truman. They didn't support him in the elections. Now they're getting paid back for it. Not what Truman's going to do this, but Truman's not have to do this to them, but the Republicans who are in charge are passing these bills, and they have the ability possibly to override Truman's veto. It also outlawed the practice of union shops known as featherbedding. What featherbedding is slowing down production. In other words, having 10 men who could make and assemble 100 cars, those 10 men assemble 80 cars, which means you need to featherbed or add more workers to keep up with production. This was a way for unions to increase their ranks and put more people in the union payroll or in jobs where the unions were representative. This kind of thing was outlawed by the Taft-Hartley Act. Truman completely opposed these ideas. He said this was horrible for the country, felt it was wrong. He vetoed the bill, but watched it get overridden by the Republicans in Congress. But now Truman's his own president, and it's time for him to stand up and be his own man. He proposes his legislative agenda. He wants to expand Social Security, raise the minimum wage, create a full employment act, and create national health insurance. Health insurance by the Republicans in Congress. But now Truman's his own president, and it's time for him to stand up and be his own man. He proposes his legislative agenda. He wants to expand Social Security, raise the minimum wage, create a full employment act, and create national health insurance. Health insurance becomes an issue during this time because we shift away more and more to the private sector. But Truman wants to create a health insurance program to cover everybody in the nation. He believes it's a fundamental right that if you live in this country, you should be able to get access to good medical care. Now, doctors in private practices disagree with him. The Republicans in Congress disagree with him. They are opposed to most of his agenda. Truman also at this time stood up and began to desegregate the military and began to say that we will have integrated units. He pushed for and called on Congress to pass a civil rights bill to give African Americans firm and fair voting rights and equal access and opportunity to all parts of America. The Republicans rejected this. Very little of his agenda was acted upon at all. They didn't like his full employment program. They felt that was too socialistic. His national health insurance, that was too expensive. But they did eventually give in to some of his expansions on Social Security. So this leads us up to the election of 1948. In 1948, Truman's running on his own this time. And he's running on the Republicans nominated a man named Thomas Dewey. Dewey was a former prosecutor, popular prosecutor, during Prohibition, who had been governor of New York. So he's a big state Republican governor. Now, during this time, a man named Strom Thurmond from the South runs on what becomes known as the states' rights or Dixiecrat ticket. Thurmond was ferociously opposed to any concepts of civil rights. He was a segregationist. Segregationist today, segregationist tomorrow, segregation forever. That was part of the mantra. Strawman said it was states' rights. Others viewed it as pro-segregation. You have your differences on how you want to look at it. So Truman gets into this race. He also has Henry Wallace, who had been in Roosevelt's cabinet and was a real progressive, real liberal party candidate, running also. And Wallace was running, saying Truman wasn't going far enough for this program. So Truman has people outflanking him politically on the left, Republicans on the right, and Strom Thurmond off on the far right. He has a huge battle ahead of him. But Truman decides, and it was widely believed, 50 national writers said, President Truman doesn't have a chance. Thomas E. Dewey's going to win in a landslide. And Truman said, I know most of those 50 writers who wrote it. He said, they don't have the sense to fill sand in a rat hole. He basically believed these guys were pretty dumb. And Truman hit the campaign trail and began talking. Back of the whistle stop, there are famous pictures. But his message became simple. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm working hard for you. Congress does nothing. They do nothing. I proposed the fair deal. I said we should have national health insurance, we should raise the minimum wage, expand Social Security, create more unemployment. They did nothing. Not one piece of legislation did they pass. Oh, let's talk about what they did do. They did cut back on workers' rights. They did close union shops. He went out and told the unions, hey, you want the Republicans? They were the ones who voted against the union shop, against the closed shop. They began to break the power of the unions. You want to vote for them? There you go. You folks on Social Security want to vote for the Republicans? They want to reduce it. There you go. He hit the campaign trail hard. Dewey sat back and ran a very reserved campaign because Dewey he was convinced. Quite simply, it was just a matter of time until the country elected him. And there's the famous portrait of Harry Truman on Election Day holding up the Chicago Daily Tribune, and the big headline read, Dewey defeats Truman. He kept that forever, as in 1948, Harry Truman thundered to 303 electoral votes and was re-elected president in 1948 to his own full term, defeating Dewey in the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, capturing parts of the South, parts of the Midwest, and sweeping The western states from California all the way through Colorado, the entire West and Midwest fell for Truman in a Democratic sweep. So Truman's now back in power. He has his own plan, and he is back in front of Congress. And this time he's got it down to the fair deal, a successor, if you will, to the New Deal of FDR. This is Truman's program, and he's calling it the fair deal. Calling for the raise in the minimum wage, once again calling for the expansion of Social Security, which he gets, calling for the civil rights again. The higher minimum wage and parts of Social Security, Truman did successfully get through. His civil rights and full employment acts, those never went through. Those were probably a little too, the civil rights just wasn't, people weren't ready for it yet. And as far as the Full Employment Act, many people consider that to be too socialistic, too much of an idea of government controlling the overall economy by trying to enforce a full employment policy on them. Full employment's a very tricky subject. So the fair deal was Truman's new program, part of which got through and part of which didn't. But soon after this, Truman's going to be consumed on the domestic front. They'll be not focused as much because the Korean War erupts and there's international crises that focuses Truman's attention. Now we turn our attention to the election of 52. In 1952, the Republicans come back. They have been out of power now for 5 successive terms. This is a long drought for the Republicans. And they turn to the former Supreme Commander of the NATO forces in Europe, of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And they had a great slogan, "I like Ike." That was their campaign slogan. Simple, quick. The Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson, the very competent governor of Illinois. Adlai Stevenson had his hair was kind of set back and he was a bit bald. He was a very brilliant man, but very intellectual. And they labeled him an egghead, his Republican opponents did, versus "I like Ike." Eisenhower absolutely blows him out. And the country sweeps back to the Republicans. And now we're going to get a new man in charge, in Dwight D. Eisenhower. Politically speaking, Eisenhower was maybe what you might call a middle-of-the-road moderate. He was conservative on business issues, but rather progressive on social issues. He called it a dynamic conservatism, which had both conservative platform and activist roots. So Eisenhower's going to be a little bit of a different on the domestic front. Part of what he wanted to do was this idea of dynamic conservatism, being conservative on business issues, but being active and open on social issues. People believed in integration. Eisenhower didn't. He was going to be prepared to push forward with it on some very key points. Eisenhower stood up for civil rights and stood up for, he took up the mantra. He didn't go so far as to call for the Civil Rights Act, but he believed in integration. And one of probably the biggest accomplishment that comes out of the Eisenhower years, besides the return to conservative business practices, such as rolling back, he in government wanted to roll back parts of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He believed these had grown too far beyond their mission of what they were set up to do, the New Deal programs, and really began to expand beyond it. But during his years, so he turns away first and says, "I'm a small government conservative," and then turns around and signs the Federal Highway Act. The Federal Highway Act was a response to the need that Americans were driving cars like never before. And in the post-World War II boom, and the economy starts to boom, really under Truman in the late 40s and takes off under Eisenhower, we're going to see some hugely prosperous years going forward. People are buying cars, they're hitting the road, but the country is not connected. We still have roads like Old Route 66, which connect the country, but they're slumbering and they kind of are winding, slow country roads. We need highways to get people from point A to point B. President Eisenhower proposes the Federal Highway Act. The Federal Highway Act is going to create the federal interstate highway system that we have today and really puts big, massive 2-lane highways and connects the United States all over the country. The Federal Highway Act was a complete success. It brought our country together, allowed goods and services to be shipped. There were roads, but now the roads were better. They were more improved. They were more direct and ran where the cities were. Those are perhaps some of the big differences. Eisenhower goes through and does extend the New Deal. He extends parts of Social Security, adds more people to it and makes them eligible. He does raise the minimum wage. Truman had raised it from 40 to 75 cents. Eisenhower takes it from 75 cents to $1. And he also helped to raise unemployment benefits for over 4 million citizens. So again, on some issues, he's small government. On other issues, he's big government. Eisenhower was a man in the middle. He strayed, every issue had its own approach. There was no ideological consensus to the man. So today we got a chance to talk about the Truman administration's efforts on the domestic front after the war, particularly the Fair Deal, his chance to try and expand national health insurance and create some new programs to help changes as the country was changing in the post-World War II years. And we got a chance to describe Eisenhower's domestic agenda, particularly his chance to roll back part of some of the New Deal programs that he felt were no longer needed since we were behind the New Deal now, as well as the Federal Highway Act, which was used to connect the country and allow us to ship goods and services for a country that's getting mobile and hitting the road.